Hello, everybody. We are continuing on with our Unit 1 review. We're talking about Foundations of American Democracy. And today we are talking about topic 1.5, which is the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Yeah, the last video we looked at some of the challenges that were presented under the articles. And moving forward, a stronger national government was obviously necessary. But there were some issues that had to be resolved. There were some compromises deemed necessary. And then there were some questions about the role of the federal government in some key areas. And there still are debates. What role does the federal government have? And if we look at what's going on, with the COVID-19 virus, the role of the national government in dealing with the economy and in helping the states and dealing with the states and then the state shutdowns and things like that. There's a lot of tension between the states and the national government as far as who has the power to govern and who has the ability to make those decisions. So we're going to look at a few of those issues today too. So the learning objective is that students will be able to explain the ongoing impact of political negotiation and compromise at the Constitutional Convention on the development of the constitutional system, right? So as we move from the Articles of Confederation, which granted very few powers to the national government, towards this new Constitution, which is going to grant a lot more power to the national government. And there were fears, right? There were fears that a stronger national government would only impose on the rights of the citizens, Brutus number one, right? So we're going to look at some of those balances, how it would balance the power. Next video, we're going to talk about the system of checks and balances and separation of powers and limited government. But there's certain compromises for specific compromises you need to know for the AP test. And the first one is the Great Compromise, also sometimes referred to as the Connecticut Compromise. Right, this is a compromise on how states would be represented in the United States Congress and the federal legislature. So there was two plans, right? The small state plan, which was the New Jersey plan, right, called for all states to be equally represented in Congress. Every state would have an equal number of votes in Congress, so the large states couldn't dominate and control the policymaking process. The large state plan, right, also known as the Virginia plan, called for more representation, or states with larger populations would have more representation in Congress, right? Because there were more people, there were more issues, they needed more people in the legislature to deal with those issues. So a state's representation in Congress would be dependent on its population. So the Great Compromise is a compromise of both those plans, right? It creates a bicameral two-house legislature with the Senate based on equal representation. All states in the U.S. Senate have 2 members in the Senate, right? So there are 2 members from every state in the United States Senate. Every state is represented equally. And then the House of Representatives was based on the Virginia plan, the large state plan, where representation in the House of Representatives is based on a state's population. So the more populous states have more representation in the House. California has the most. They're the most populated state, so they have 53 seats in the House, where some of the smaller states have just 1 vote. North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, some of the smaller states, less populated states, have only 1 vote, right? So that's the Great Compromise. The second compromise is the Electoral College, right? The Electoral College is a compromise between basically the people and the framers of the Constitution. The framers of the Constitution did not trust the people to make a good decision when electing the President of the United States. So they basically set up this safeguard, right? A safety net, this elite group which would be deemed or given the task of choosing the President of the United States, the Electoral College, right? So the popular vote of every state determines how the electoral votes are awarded and who they're awarded to, but it's the Electoral College, this elite group of members chosen by the political parties themselves, the political party VIPs, that officially elect the President of the United States, right? So that's the group that officially chooses and elects the President of the United States. during the election. The Three-Fifths Compromise, right? Another compromise between, this one's really between the North and the South, right? Because we know that the House of Representatives is going to be based on a state's population, right? So this all had to do with how slaves were going to be counted as population, right? The northern states did not feel that slaves should be counted as a population. Should not be counted as people towards a population. They weren't considered people back then. Slaves were not considered people. Dred Scott versus Sanford says basically slaves are property of their slave owners, right? So therefore, because all of the slaves were basically populated in the South, right? They didn't feel that they should be counted as people because that was going to give a lot more representation in the House of Representatives to the South. Whereas the South said we should count them as population, right? Even though they weren't technically considered people, we should still count them as population because that's going to give the southern states a higher population if you count the slaves as people, right? And it's going to give them more representation in the House of Representatives. So basically, the framers of the Constitution created this compromise between the North and the South on how slaves would be counted, and basically said that for a state's population, a slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person, or every 5 slaves would count as 3 people towards a state's population. So that was kind of the compromise they came up with between how slaves would be counted as population between the North and the South. And then the last one is the compromise on the importation of slave trade, right? That basically, this is a compromise between the pro-slavery movement and the anti-slavery movement, which was obviously kind of more situated in the North. It's still kind of a North-South thing, but it's really those that opposed slavery and those that favored slavery. And basically, as a young country starting out, Congress agrees that they will not ban the importation of slaves for at least 20 years. So 1808 would be the year that the slave trade is officially banned by Congress, but not for 20 years because of the South's dependency on slave labor and their production of obviously cotton and the cheap labor that was provided by slavery in the South was necessary for southern states and their economies. So that was the fourth compromise that you need to be familiar with. The debates about self-government during the drafting of the Constitution necessitated the drafting of the amendment process in Article 5, right? So you need to know that Article 5 of the Constitution is the amendment process. There's the process for adding amendments to the Constitution. We know that the first 10 amendments of Bill of Rights are ratified with the Constitution, right? So the Constitution, the first 10 amendments are ratified in 1788, go into effect in 1789, right? So since 1789, the Constitution has only been ratified 17 times, right? Amendments 11 through 27. And this is because of the process. It is a difficult process to amend the Constitution, and the framers wanted the Constitution to be flexible. They wanted it to be a living document that was going to last, especially coming from the failures of the Articles of Confederation. And so they knew that if it was going to last, it had to be adaptable. There had to be flexibility and opportunity for change. So they include that in Article 5 of the Constitution. Article 5 says that basically the amendment process will be a 2-step process, right? The first step is proposing an amendment. So amendments, can be proposed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress. So if 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House vote to propose an amendment, the amendment is proposed, right? Just means that it's been proposed. Doesn't mean it's going to be added to the Constitution, but it would be proposed through that method. Or a amendment can also be proposed by states calling conventions in 2/3 of the states. So state conventions in 2/3 of the states. If state conventions are called in 2/3 of the states to propose an amendment, then that amendment would also be proposed, right? So 2/3 of Congress or 2/3 of state conventions. And then once an amendment is proposed, and remember, the most common way is the 2/3 of Congress, right? The only amendment to be proposed and ratified by state conventions was the 21st Amendment, which overturned the 18th Amendment, overturned prohibition, right? So then after an amendment is proposed, it then has to be ratified. If it's not ratified, the amendment dies. It's not added to the Constitution, right? So in order to be ratified, it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures, right? So the state Congresses, the state legislatures have to vote to ratify the amendment in 3/4 of the states, okay? So if that happens, so 38 of the 50 states vote to ratify it, then that amendment would be ratified and officially added to the Constitution. Right, so proposal and ratification, make sure you know that. And then the last essential knowledge is the debate over the role of central government, the powers of state governments, and the rights of individuals remains at the heart of present-day constitutional issues about democracy and government power, as demonstrated by debates about government surveillance resulting from the federal government's response to the 9/11 attacks. Right, we talk about the role of the federal government, right? We know that during times of crises, if we look at the New Deal, if we look at the Civil War, right, we look at 9/11, we look right now, right, with COVID-19, the federal government tends to take a more active, a bigger response is necessary for the national government in dealing with these crises. So the federal government oftentimes will come in and deal with issues that often don't apply to them, right? And if we look about the attack on 9/11, right, Congress passes the USA Patriot Act, right, which basically allows the government to monitor and allows for surveillance of emails, phone calls, text messages, things like that, right, to prevent terrorism. So it's a restriction on freedom in order to maintain order in the United States, right? The USA Patriot Act, which basically allows the federal government to wiretap our phone calls, our emails, text messages, right? All personal communications. And then the debate about the role of the federal government in public school education, right? There's really nothing in the Constitution that gives the federal government the power to regulate education, right? But we do have a Department of Education, right? We have a Secretary of Education, which basically oversees the education process in the United States. So many people believe that the concept of education is best left to the states, right? The states are best left to deal with education because education, the levels of education and the laws passed regarding education vary from state to state, right? So that should be a state issue. 10th Amendment should reserve that power to the states. But the federal government has kind of involved themselves in this department, right? And it has been a big source of contention, a big source of struggle between the national government and the state government. State governments believe that they are better apt to deal with that. The federal government has passed laws like No Child Left Behind, which requires mandated standardized tests, right? We all love those. And, that states are, if they are passing students, if they're assessing students, state mandated tests, then they would receive funding from the government, right? So we talk about the aid given from the national government to the states. This is one of those things where, the national government can get the states to do what they want by offering aid to those states and allows them to insert themselves into education and pass laws pertaining to education. So those are kind of the two issues, right? Surveillance, especially 9/11, the USA Patriot Act, and education. Education being a little bit more of a gray area because there's, again, nothing in the Constitution that talks about education. So many people believe that that's a 10th Amendment issue that should be left to the states. But the federal government has inserted their power and their role in the federal government. So in the role of education. So hopefully that makes sense. That's it for topic 1.5, ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Hope you enjoyed it, and take care, y'all. Bye.